Clint Eastwood was just taking a peaceful walk when a rich landowner sneered, "Turn around, old man, this ain't your land." The air grew thick with tension. Ranch hands smirked, expecting Clint to back down. But instead of arguing, Clint just smiled. Because he had a plan. What he did next shook the entire town, ruined a corrupt empire, and turned arrogance into a brutal lesson. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The crisp evening air carried the scent of dry earth and sagebrush as Clint Eastwood walked along a weathered fence line, his boots pressing softly into the dirt. The landscape stretched for miles, rolling hills golden under the setting sun, a place he hadn't laid eyes on in years. The land held history, memories, roots that ran deeper than any contract or deed. A sudden roar of an engine shattered the quiet. A battered black pickup tore down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust before skidding to a stop a few yards away. The driver's side door creaked open, and out stepped Nathan Beckett, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, dressed in an expensive ranch coat, cowboy hat tilted just enough to seem intentional. His smirk was the kind that carried money and entitlement. "You lost, old man." Beckett's voice dripped with arrogance as he leaned against the hood of his truck, arms crossed. His two ranch hands climbed out as well, looming figures who cracked their knuckles like they were waiting for an excuse. "This ain't your kind of place." Clint exhaled slowly, keeping his hands tucked in his coat pockets. His gaze flickered across the land, then landed on Beckett with a calm that sent an unspoken warning. "Didn't know walking was a crime." Beckett chuckled, pushing off the truck and taking a few slow steps forward. "Not a crime," he said, kicking a rock aside, "but it sure ain't welcome. See, folks like you come around with your stories, thinking you belong." His eyes narrowed. "But you don't." One of the ranch hands, a thick-necked brute with a scar down his cheek, took a step closer. "Maybe you ought to turn back." Clint still didn't move. He could feel the shift in the air, tension tightening like a coiled rattlesnake, waiting to strike. He had seen men like Beckett before, ones who mistook wealth for power, mistook their hired muscle for real strength. He lifted his chin just slightly, looking Beckett dead in the eye. "Son," Clint muttered, his voice gravelly and low. "You sure about that?" Beckett's smirk twitched for half a second, but he quickly covered it up with a laugh. "You got some nerve, old-timer." He gestured to his men, their boots scuffing against the gravel as they took another step forward. Clint's fingers twitched at his sides, but his expression never changed. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying silence with it. The ranch hands hesitated. They had a feeling, one they couldn't quite explain, something about the way Clint Eastwood stood there, unfazed, unshaken, looking at them like he had already seen how this was going to end. And it wasn't going to end in their favor. The dry wind carried the sound of rustling grass as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, stretching shadows across the dirt road. The air between Clint and Beckett grew heavier, thick with an unspoken tension. Clint stood still, his face unreadable, while Beckett's smirk widened with a cocky sort of amusement. Then with slow, deliberate contempt, Beckett turned his head and spat onto the ground near Clint's feet. The wad of tobacco-stained spit landed inches from Clint's boot, darkening the dust beneath it. "I don't like outsiders nosing around," Beckett drawled, his voice laced with arrogance. He rocked back on his heels, thumbs hooked into his belt like he was waiting for Clint to flinch. Clint didn't flinch. He barely blinked. One of Beckett's ranch hands, a burly man with a thick beard and a scar running down his left cheek, took a step forward, cracking his knuckles. He loomed over Clint, clearly hoping his size alone would be enough to send a message. "Boss told you to get lost," he grunted. Clint shifted slightly, adjusting his jacket with slow precision, then locked eyes with the ranch hand. The man hesitated, just for a second. Something about Clint's stare made his throat go dry. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was knowing. Beckett exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if amused by the whole thing. "Ain't got time for dusty relics like you," he scoffed, flicking a glance toward his men. "I'd hate to have to put you in the ground for trespassing. Walk away." Clint tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his next words. The silence stretched just long enough to make Beckett shift his weight. Then Clint's voice cut through the air, low and firm. "I don't take orders from bullies." Beckett's smirk faltered. Just for a second, The ranch hands, once so sure of their intimidation, shifted uneasily. They had been around violence before, but this was different. This wasn't a man trying to prove something. This wasn't bravado or empty threats. This was a man who had already decided exactly how things would play out, and he wasn't the one who'd be walking away with regret. Beckett's nostrils flared as his jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck tensed, a telltale sign that his patience had run thin. Then in a moment he would later regret, he clenched his fist and raised it. Clint didn't move, didn't react. Not yet. He simply exhaled through his nose, his gaze never leaving Beckett's. And that's when Beckett made his biggest mistake. The wooden post came free from the ground with a sharp crack, sending dust flying into the air as Beckett yanked it loose. He didn't hesitate. With a wild grin, he swung the heavy beam toward Clint's legs, aiming to knock him off his feet. But Clint wasn't there anymore. In a movement so fast it barely registered, Clint sidestepped, his body shifting with the ease of a man who had seen and avoided far worse. The wooden post sliced through empty air, and Beckett nearly stumbled forward with the force of his own swing. Laughter erupted from the ranch hands, but it wasn't the confident, mocking kind from before. It was nervous, uncertain. They had expected Beckett to take control, to show the old man his place. Instead, it was Beckett who looked like a fool. Clint exhaled through his nose, slow and measured, his gaze sharpening. Beckett turned, jaw tightening in frustration. "Thought you were faster, cowboy," he sneered, gripping the post with white knuckles. Clint's voice dropped a note lower, losing any trace of the patience he had allowed until now. "You just made this real stupid." The way he said it sent a chill through the men standing around them. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. One of Beckett's ranch hands, the same bearded man who had tried to intimidate Clint earlier, shifted uneasily. He stepped closer to Beckett, lowering his voice. Boss? You sure about this?" Beckett ignored him. His pride was already wounded, and now there was an audience watching. He wouldn't back down. He adjusted his grip on the post, planting his feet firmly in the dirt. "You got two choices, old man," he spat. "Either you walk off my land, or I make you." Clint slowly tilted his head, considering the words. He flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders just enough to loosen the tension that had settled there. His knuckles cracked, the sound crisp and deliberate. Beckett swallowed. The sound alone sent a message. The men around them took a collective step back. They weren't dumb. They had seen enough fights in their time to know when things were about to turn. This wasn't going to be some bar brawl. This was about to be a reckoning. Clint squared his stance, his boots firm against the dry earth. His hands, relaxed but ready, hung by his sides, waiting for the inevitable. Beckett's nostrils flared as he lifted the post again. But this time, he hesitated. He saw it now. That calm, that patience, that unshakable look in Clint's eyes. He had been in control a moment ago. Now he wasn't so sure. Beckett's face twisted in rage, his humiliation boiling over into reckless aggression. He gripped the wooden post tighter, knuckles turning white, and lunged at Clint without a second thought. Big mistake. In a blur of motion, Clint sidestepped, shifting just enough to avoid the reckless attack. Before Beckett could recover, Clint's hand shot out, fingers closing around Beckett's wrist with a steel grip. There was no hesitation. With a sharp twist, Clint spun Beckett's arm backward, forcing him off balance. A pained yelp tore from Beckett's throat as he crumpled to his knees, the wooden post slipping from his grasp and thudding against the dry earth. Silence. The ranch hands, who had been smirking and puffing their chests only moments ago, stood frozen. None of them had expected this. None of them had seen Clint move. They had assumed he was just some old cowboy past his prime. Now they weren't so sure. Beckett gasped through gritted teeth, his free hand clawing at the dirt as he tried to regain control of the situation. But Clint didn't let go. He leaned in slightly, voice cold and measured. "This was your only warning." Beckett's breath hitched. Clint let go abruptly, shoving Beckett backward. He toppled onto the ground, coughing, as dust kicked up around him. The ranch hands shifted nervously, exchanging uncertain glances. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a scruffy beard, took half a step forward. "Boss?" Beckett ignored him, pushing himself up with shaking arms. His face was red with fury, his ego bruised more than his body. He had spent years throwing his weight around, bullying men into submission. But this wasn't how it was supposed to go. He clenched his jaw, wiping sweat and dirt from his brow. His eyes locked onto Clint, filled with seething resentment. "You're gonna regret that," he growled, voice low and venomous. Clint barely reacted. He adjusted his jacket, brushing off imaginary dust, then looked Beckett dead in the eye. "No," Clint said simply. "You are." The ranch hand stiffened. Beckett's nostrils flared, but he didn't lunge this time. Something in Clint's tone had changed. It wasn't a threat. It was a certainty. For the first time in his life, Nathan Beckett wasn't the one in control. A faint breeze rustled the dry grass, the only sound in the thick, heavy silence. Beckett's fingers curled into fists. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Beckett's hands were still shaking as he pushed himself up from the dirt, his pride wounded far worse than his body. He could feel the weight of his ranch hands' stares, some shocked, some amused, others hesitant, as if they were realizing for the first time that their boss wasn't as invincible as he always claimed. He wasn't going to let that stand. With a sharp inhale, Beckett yanked his phone from his back pocket, his fingers gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't even glance at Clint, didn't acknowledge the man who had just humiliated him. Instead, he turned away, tapping the screen furiously as he put the phone to his ear. "Sheriff!" His voice was sharp, urgent, dripping with forced outrage. "We got a problem. Some old man thinks he owns my land. Yeah, I need you out here now." Clint tilted his head slightly, watching Beckett with the same calm, knowing expression he'd held since the moment the man had stepped out of his truck. His silence was unsettling, and Beckett knew it. He could feel the older man's eyes on him, patient and unwavering, like a predator waiting for its prey to make its final mistake. A smirk tugged at Clint's lips. Beckett shoved his phone back into his pocket, turning on his heel. "That ought to do it," he sneered, though the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Let's see how tough you are when the law's on my side." Clint didn't flinch. If anything, his smirk widened just a fraction. The ranch hands shifted uncomfortably. A few of them exchanged wary glances. They had all seen the sheriff operate before. Sheriff Dale Mercer wasn't just the law in these parts. He was Beckett's drinking buddy, his business partner in the shadows, the man who made sure every under-the-table deal Beckett pulled stayed buried. If Mercer was on his way, it didn't matter what was right or wrong. He would find a way to twist things in Beckett's favor. And yet, Clint still didn't move. A low, distant wail broke through the silence, growing louder by the second. The unmistakable howl of sirens echoed across the open land. Beckett straightened his shoulders, his confidence returning with each passing second as the flashing red and blue lights appeared over the horizon. "There we go," he muttered, rolling his shoulders. He turned to Clint, his smirk creeping back into place. "Now, old man, let's see if you're still so damn cocky when you're in handcuffs." Clint didn't answer. He just shifted his weight slightly, hands in his pockets, as if the situation was barely worth his time. The squad car skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust, the sirens cutting off with a sharp chirp. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped Sheriff Mercer, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his smirking face. But Clint? He didn't move an inch. Sheriff Dale Mercer stepped out of the squad car like he owned the place. He adjusted his belt, thumb resting lazily on the buckle, while his other hand tipped the brim of his hat just enough to get a good look at the situation. His lips curled into a smug grin as he spotted Beckett, who was standing a little too stiffly, trying to mask the fact that he had just been humiliated in front of his own men. Mercer didn't need to ask what happened. He already knew. He sauntered up to Beckett, extending a hand like they were old friends. Beckett clasped it tightly, his fingers digging in just a little too hard, as if squeezing the sheriff's palm would help him regain some of the power he had lost. "Damn good timing, Sheriff," Beckett said, voice thick with relief. He jerked his chin toward Clint. "We got ourselves a problem." Mercer turned his attention to Clint, the grin never leaving his face. He sized up the old man standing there, calm, unbothered, hands still tucked in the pockets of his worn leather jacket. "Well, well," Mercer drawled, shaking his head like he just found a stray dog on his porch. "Mr. Eastwood, I do believe you're trespassing." Clint finally moved, tilting his head just slightly. His gaze locked onto Mercer's, sharp and steady. "I'd hate to have to arrest you," Mercer added, voice dripping with mock sympathy. Clint let out a slow exhale, as if he were deciding whether or not this was even worth his time. Then, with deliberate slowness, he took a step forward. "That's supposed to scare me?" For the first time, Mercer's grin faltered. Just a fraction, just for a second. But Clint caught it, and so did a few of the ranch hands who had been watching closely. Beckett, however, was oblivious. He was too busy soaking in the moment, feeding off the illusion of power Mercer's presence gave him. His cocky smirk returned in full force. "Yeah, I think it should," Beckett sneered. "See, out here, we take property rights real serious. And last I checked, this land," he gestured with a grand sweep of his arm, "this all belongs to me." A few of the ranch hands nodded, but there was hesitation now, uncertainty. Clint didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't give Beckett the satisfaction of a single ounce of fear. Instead, he did something that made the younger man's confidence crack at the edges. He smiled, a slow, knowing smirk that sent a ripple of unease through the air. Then, just as deliberately as everything else he had done so far, Clint reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Mercer tensed slightly, but Clint wasn't pulling out a weapon. He pulled out something far more dangerous, a folded document. He held it up between two fingers, giving it a little shake. "Read it," Clint said, tossing it toward Mercer. The sheriff caught it, frowning as he unfolded the thick paper. His eyes scanned the words, his smirk slowly draining with each passing second. Beckett noticed. "What? What the hell does it say?" Mercer didn't answer right away. His jaw twitched, his hand clenched around the paper. Beckett, impatient, snatched it from him, his eyes darting over the words. His face went pale. That ain't possible," he stammered. Clint crossed his arms. "Reckon you're standing on borrowed ground, boy?" Sheriff Mercer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably as the weight of the document in his hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. His eyes darted over the paper, scanning the fine print, and as the realization sank in, his usual smug expression drained away. The men standing behind Beckett watched, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion. They weren't used to seeing their boss rattled. "Well?" Clint's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Go on, Sheriff. Read it out loud." Mercer hesitated, then swallowed hard before clearing his throat once more. His voice, usually so thick with arrogance, came out a little less sure this time. "This document states that the land in question was never legally transferred to Nathan Beckett," Mercer read. "It remains under the ownership of the original title holder's estate, which—" He paused, blinking as if hoping the words would change. "Which means this land ain't yours, Beckett." A low murmur swept through the gathered men, a few shifting uneasily. Beckett snatched the paper from Mercer's hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he scanned the text himself. His breathing grew heavier. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "That can't be right." "It's right," Clint said calmly, hands resting easily on his belt buckle. "That there's a legal document, signed, stamped, and verified by the county registrar." Beckett's jaw tightened. His face turned red, a mixture of embarrassment and rage boiling beneath the surface. "This is a lie," he spat, shaking the paper. "Some kind of trick." Clint didn't flinch, didn't react, just stood there, a statue of unshakable confidence. "You think I came here without doing my homework?" Clint asked, tilting his head slightly. "You think I'd step onto land that wasn't mine without knowing the truth first?" Beckett opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. His mind was spinning, searching for a way out, a loophole, anything that could put the power back in his hands. But there was nothing. One of the ranch hands, Paul, a wiry man who had been with Beckett for years, took a cautious step forward. "Boss, is it true?" Beckett's nostrils flared. "Shut up," he snapped. "This is my land." Clint took a slow step forward, eyes locked onto Beckett's. "Reckon you're standing on borrowed ground, boy." Beckett's fingers clenched into fists. His whole world was slipping through his grasp, and he wasn't the kind of man who let go easily. And Clint could see it. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Beckett's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he gripped the document in his shaking hands. His face, already red with fury, darkened even further, veins popping along his temple. He looked up at Clint, his nostrils flaring, his eyes wild with rage. "You forged this," he snarled, his voice cracking with desperation. "This ain't real." Clint didn't move, didn't blink. He simply studied Beckett, as if watching an animal backed into a corner. "The truth ain't something you get to rewrite, son," Clint said evenly. "That paper's legal and you know it." Sheriff Mercer shifted uncomfortably beside Beckett, rubbing the back of his neck. He wanted to deny it, to stand firm beside his longtime friend, but the weight of the document in his hands told him otherwise. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to recognize an airtight deed when he saw one. Beckett, Mercer hesitated, lowering his voice. We got to think this through. Think what through? Beckett spat, rounding on the sheriff. You were supposed to have my back. I got your back, Mercer shot back, his voice barely above a whisper. But that paper's real, and if we go against it, Beckett's hand shot out, gripping Mercer's shirt, dragging him close. You listen to me, Dale, he hissed. You fix this. I don't care what it takes. Clint tilted his head, his gaze locking onto Mercer like a hawk sizing up prey. You got a choice to make, Sheriff, Clint said, his voice calm but firm. You uphold the law, or you dig your own grave. Mercer swallowed hard, torn between self-preservation and loyalty to a man who had lined his pockets for years. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then the distant sound of tires crunching against gravel cut through the quiet. A second police cruiser was approaching. The air shifted. Beckett's face twisted in confusion, then panic. What the hell is this? Clint didn't answer. He just watched as the second car rolled to a stop, dust swirling around its tires. The door swung open, and out stepped a state trooper, one Clint recognized. Trooper Harris, a man with a reputation for sniffing out corruption, adjusted his belt and took a slow look around before locking eyes with Mercer. We got a problem here? Harris asked, his tone neutral, but his gaze sharp. Beckett's hands curled into fists. He knew in that moment his grip on this land, on this town, was slipping. And Clint? He simply smiled, because he knew Beckett was out of moves. Sheriff Mercer stiffened as the state trooper stepped forward, his presence radiating authority. Beckett, still reeling from the legal document Clint had thrown in his face, turned slowly, his jaw tightening as he took in the sight of the new arrival. Trooper Harris was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his uniform crisp, his eyes sharp and unreadable. He stopped beside Clint, his gaze shifting between Beckett and Mercer before settling on the sheriff. We've been investigating Beckett's dealings for a while, Harris said, his voice level but firm. Didn't expect to catch you two red-handed like this. Mercer's mouth opened slightly, then snapped shut. His fingers twitched at his belt, as if itching for an escape. I don't know what you think is going on here, Mercer started, his voice uneven. But this is just a misunderstanding. Harris raised an eyebrow. Is that right? He pulled out a folded paper from his breast pocket and flicked it open. Because I've got sworn statements from more than a few folks around town that say otherwise. Beckett's face paled. He glanced at Mercer, then back at Clint, as if trying to calculate his next move. This is bull. You should stop talking, Beckett, Harris cut in, tucking the paper back into his pocket. You're just digging yourself a deeper hole. The ranch hands, who had been standing back, watching the tension unfold, began to shift uneasily. Some of them took a step back, as if realizing they wanted no part in what was about to happen. Clint remained silent, watching with the patience of a man who had seen this kind of downfall play out before. He could see the sweat forming at Mercer's temple, the twitch in Beckett's jaw as he clenched his teeth. Beckett suddenly straightened, forcing a laugh. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. You got me. Maybe I made some deals that weren't exactly by the book, but you can't prove a damn thing. Harris tilted his head. That's so? Beckett smirked. You don't have a warrant. You don't have evidence. This whole thing is just some washed-up cowboy making a fuss. Harris reached for his radio, pressing a button. You want to tell him, Jim? Static crackled before a voice came through. Yeah, we got it all on record. The money laundering, the land fraud. It's a wrap. Beckett froze. Mercer's breath hitched. Clint finally spoke, his voice calm, unwavering. Told you, son. Reckon you're standing on borrowed ground. Harris nodded toward his partner. Go ahead. Arrest them both. Beckett's face twisted in fury as the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Sheriff Mercer didn't look much better. His face had gone sheet white, his hands trembling slightly as the trooper locked his cuffs in place. The crowd of ranch hands, who had been watching with a mix of amusement and apprehension, now stood frozen, their eyes darting between Beckett and Clint. This is a damn mistake, Beckett bellowed, yanking against the cuffs. You have no right. Trooper Harris cut him off with a firm shove toward the patrol car. You've got the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. Clint, standing with his hands casually resting on his belt, watched as Mercer and Beckett were hauled toward the vehicles. He shook his head slightly, as if this had all played out exactly how he'd expected. You think this changes anything? Beckett spat, his boots dragging against the dirt. You think one old man and some lousy paperwork mean a damn? Clint took a slow step forward, his boots kicking up dust. I don't think, son. I know. The sheriff, who had been trying to maintain some semblance of composure, suddenly lunged toward Harris. This is harassment, he barked. I've got rights. You... Harris grabbed him by the back of his collar and forced him into the back seat of the squad car with practiced ease. Yeah, tell it to the judge. The gathered ranch hands exchanged uneasy glances. For years, they had followed Beckett without question, doing his dirty work, running his land, and keeping quiet about the things they saw. But now their so-called leader was in the back of a police cruiser, and the man who had brought him down hadn't even broken a sweat. Clint turned to the men, letting the weight of the moment settle. His eyes scanned each of them, his gaze as sharp as ever. Might want to start looking for a new boss, he said evenly, 'cause I don't think this one's coming back anytime soon. A few of the younger ranch hands nodded hesitantly, realizing that their future on this land had just changed forever. Others lowered their heads, too ashamed to meet Clint's eyes. Beckett, now red-faced with rage, threw his shoulder against the squad car door, rattling it in frustration. This ain't over, he howled. You hear me, Eastwood? You can't do this. Clint let out a quiet chuckle and adjusted his hat. He leaned down slightly, just enough so Beckett could see the amusement in his eyes. Oh, I already did. As the police cars drove off, a familiar figure stepped forward, an old man holding a faded document in his hands. The dust had barely settled on the road when the last of the squad cars disappeared over the horizon, carrying Nathan Beckett and Sheriff Mercer toward the fate they had so long deserved. The once tense atmosphere on the ranch shifted like a breath of fresh air rolling in over the plains. A slow ripple of realization passed through the gathered ranch hands and onlookers. Justice had been served, and the land was finally in the right hands. Then a sound broke the silence. It started with a single clap, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire town erupted into cheers. People from the outskirts of the property had gathered. Farmers, ranchers, old cowboys who had spent decades under Beckett's rule. Some had suffered under his greed. Others had simply stayed out of his way. But now, for the first time in years, they felt free. A few of the ranch hands, still unsure of where they stood, glanced around nervously. Some shifted uncomfortably, as if waiting for Beckett to return and restore order. But he wasn't coming back. Not now. Not ever. Clint Eastwood stood still in the midst of the celebration, unmoved by the applause. He wasn't one for grandstanding, and he sure as hell wasn't looking for gratitude. He simply adjusted his hat and nodded toward the state trooper, who returned the gesture with a respectful tip of his own. Appreciate the backup, Clint said in his usual gravelly tone. Something tells me you didn't really need it. The coroner trooper replied with a knowing smirk. Clint allowed the hint of a smile to tug at the corner of his lips, but didn't say a word. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the wide-open land, stretching beyond the horizon. It had been years since he set foot here, yet it still felt familiar in ways he couldn't quite put into words. The hills, the trees, even the way the wind whispered through the grass. It all spoke to a part of him that had long been buried under time and distance. Just as he was about to turn away, an old man emerged from the crowd, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His frail frame moved slowly, but his eyes burned with an intensity that suggested he had something important to say. In his weathered hands, he clutched an old, yellowed document, the edges worn and frayed by time. Mr. Eastwood, the old man rasped, his voice hoarse but steady. You might want to take a look at this. Clint narrowed his eyes, watching the man approach. There was something about him, something familiar, like a ghost from a past he had long forgotten. What is it? Clint asked, his voice calm but curious. The old man hesitated for just a moment, then carefully extended the document toward Clint. It's proof, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Proof that this land was never supposed to belong to Beckett, because it belonged to your family. Clint slowly reached for the document, his mind racing with questions. Clint Eastwood had always been a man who lived in the present, never one to dwell too long on the past. But as his weathered fingers traced the fragile edges of the old deed, a strange feeling settled over him, one he hadn't felt in years. The old man, still gripping his cane for support, watched Clint carefully. This land, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades, was taken from your people a long time ago. Beckett's family got their hands on it through trickery and greed, but it was never rightfully theirs. It always belonged to the Eastwoods. Clint remained silent, scanning the document. The paper, yellowed and creased, bore the signature of his great-grandfather. His name was etched in ink as the rightful owner of this land, a truth that had been buried beneath generations of corruption. A gust of wind swept across the open plains, rustling the grass and sending dust swirling into the air. The land stretched far and wide, untouched in places, scarred in others. Clint let out a slow breath, absorbing the reality of it all. This wasn't just any land. This was his bloodline, his history. "You're telling me," Clint finally spoke, his voice low and steady, "that this place was mine all along?" The old man nodded. "And now it can be yours again." The crowd stood in stunned silence, waiting for Clint's reaction. Some of them had called this land home for years under Beckett's rule, never knowing the truth. Others had suspected foul play, but lacked the power to do anything about it. Now, with Beckett gone and the sheriff in handcuffs, the truth was out in the open. Justice had come full circle. Clint stared at the deed a moment longer before folding it carefully and slipping it into his jacket pocket. He didn't need to say much. His quiet acceptance spoke louder than words. He turned to the ranch hands who had once worked under Beckett's thumb. "This land ain't just mine," he said, his voice carrying across the open space. "It belongs to those who respect it, those who work it. If you're willing to do that, there's a place for you here." A murmur rippled through the crowd, relief settling into the faces of men and women who had once feared for their futures. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows over the rolling hills. Clint walked toward his horse, adjusting his hat against the setting light. He placed one boot in the stirrup, swung himself into the saddle with an ease that defied his years, and looked over the land one last time. He had come here expecting a fight. He was leaving with something far greater, a legacy restored. As he nudged his horse forward, the people watched him go, knowing they had just witnessed something rare. A legend wasn't just a story people told. It was something you lived. And Clint Eastwood? His legend had only grown stronger that day. With the golden horizon stretching before him, he rode off into the sunset, the land finally at peace behind him. The legend of Clint Eastwood, it only grew stronger that day.